My name is Ted Landsmark. I'm a professor of public policy in the School of Public Policy here at Northeastern. You have tuned into the open classroom, which this semester is covering issues of race and anti-Semitism and efforts that can be made to heal a number of divides that exist at this point in our history. We have several speakers tonight from Northeastern University. There was in today's Northeastern News an article about this class, so I know that we have some additional visitors in our online component of this class. I'll just say before we begin that we welcome any questions or comments that you may have. You can send them into our chat, and we will do our best to get to all of the questions that come in from our online participants. And with that, I'm going to turn the podium here over to my esteemed colleague, Karl Reid, who is the Senior Vice Provost and Chief Inclusion Officer, and also a Professor of Practice in our Graduate School of Education here at Northeastern. And Karl will address some of the responses that the university is now making and proposes to make around issues of diversity and inclusion. We have all of our participants here wearing masks, except for when they are presenting, which accounts for why I'm not wearing a mask at this moment, but I will shortly. And I'll just make note of the fact that I'm wearing my vote mask as a reminder that a week from now, we will know who our new mayor of Boston will be and who our city councilors would be. The election is being held next Tuesday. And in the most recent primary, voter turnout was only about 22%. So I'm going to urge anyone who is connecting to this program tonight to exercise your own rights of inclusivity and to please turn out to vote next Tuesday. And with that, Karl, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Professor Landsmark. Good evening, everyone. And wherever you are, good afternoon and good morning as well. So it's a pleasure to be here, to be a part of this classroom experience. As Professor Landsmark mentioned, I am only 7 months into this job. I came from the National Society of Black Engineers, and I'm going to share with you a little about my background. I call it the path to purpose, because I do want to make this a little personal about my journey, but also talk about what we are endeavoring to do here at Northeastern to produce a more inclusive university across our global network as well. I do want to just kind of address something that Professor Kaufman talked about in a few of his slides. As I came in, I heard the citing some of the research. When I talk about diversity, I'm a non-traditional chief diversity officer. I am an engineer by training. I spent 12 years in the software industry in product management, product marketing, sales, et cetera. Then I took a huge pay cut, 30% pay cut, and went back to higher education to run engineering outreach programs at MIT. And then I ran the engineering internship program for a bunch of years. While I was there, I got my doctorate in education part-time up the street at that other school in Cambridge. And then I got promoted and was offered an associate dean position. And so I moved from supporting just about 800 pre-college students to all the undergraduates at the university. Then I became a senior vice president at United Negro College Fund in Washington, D.C., supporting HBCUs. Then I became the executive director of the National Society of Black Engineers, the very organization that got me my start in leadership on campus when I was an undergraduate. right? And then I'm here now as the Chief Diversity Officer. And so one of the things that I've learned, especially in my work with IBM, and I'm still wearing my IBM blues, is that you can't sell a customer on a product or solution until you understand their needs, right? You can't force something on someone to buy something. You have to take the time to understand their needs and then position the solutions according to their needs. So when we talk about sort of diversity, we have to I kind of frame diversity in matters that are important to you. Women, men, white, black, blue, whatever it is, gay, straight, whatever. Why is it important? Why should it be important to you? So if any of you studying science or have ever taken a science course, right, which should be everyone, one of the things we learn is that at the end of the derivation or the equation, the units on the right side of the equation should match the units on the left side of the equation, right? If you are talking about miles per hour or meters per second on the right side, they should look like miles per hour or meters per second on the left side. And so I talk often about diversity in terms of matching the units. So in other words, what's important to you? What are the units that are important to you? If miles per hour is important to you, then I have to frame conversations about diversity in ways that you understand and appreciate. So in education, what matters is learning. And now we know that diverse classrooms foster greater learning because it invokes more cognitive dissonance in the classroom. And not just for the students, but for the professors as well. That diverse classrooms are much better for the class, professors as well as students, because you're more likely to have the aha moments when somebody brings a different perspective that you had not expected. Otherwise, you suffer from what is called confirmation bias. You're just confirming what you already knew. You're not growing in that experience. So research that Sylvia Hurtado and others have done shows that cognitive dissonance occurs in classrooms that are diverse. Check. What about research? One study was done of 1.5 million scientific papers and found that if there is a diverse research team, that is by ethnicity, by gender, and by institution, you are more likely to produce research that's cited more broadly. Why is that? Because of the aha moments that occur when you have diversity in the research team. Different perspective, different mental models are introduced when you have more than one person or two or three, et cetera, from multiple institutions. So your research is more likely to be cited to the degree to which you involve more people, more institutions, and more frameworks, more discipline. Check. Education, check. Research, check. What about industry? We know from work that McKinsey has done and Boston Consulting Group and others have done that institutions that have a diverse board of directors of senior leadership are more likely, and as much 35% more likely to produce higher financial returns than those less diverse. What are companies interested in? Earnings, shareholder value, right? Employee retention. All those are associated with organizations that are more diverse than the homogeneous ones. So putting diversity in terms that matter to other individuals turn those white males who might be resistant to diversity training into allies. And in fact, Lockheed Martin has actually created an affinity group called Allies for Inclusion. These are white males working together to advance the inclusive and diversity goals of the corporation, right? So there are ways to kind of frame this in a way that sort of engages people, gets people involved by matching their units, finding out what matters to you and framing it that way. Does that make sense? Yes? Good, good. The other thing I want to just talk about is this whole notion of why diversity matters. And I'm going to probably skip through a couple of the slides, but more importantly, get to the questions. Diversity is not inclusion. Diversity is a means to inclusion. Now, what do I mean by that? Diversity is about representation. It's about difference. It's our identities, my pronouns, he, his, and him, my cisgender, male, Christian, et cetera, et cetera. You can kind of bring all my identities into the mix, and your identities and others, your ethnicity, your race, your gender identity, your veteran status, your ability status, all these things coming about. That's really what diversity is. We set a goal at the university that we would be representative of the countries we operate, US, UK, et cetera. That's a good goal. It's not a quota, it's a goal. That by 2026, we would have classrooms, we would have laboratories, we'd have offices that look like the United States in terms of the diversity breakdown. But that's not a sufficient goal, because once we have that, we have more likely to have these serendipitous collisions that produce that aha moment. And when those aha moments occur, we challenge each other, what Sylvia Hurtado calls meaningful interactions, and ultimately, we can mitigate our own biases that we all carry with us. The Kirwan Institute says implicit bias is the equal opportunity virus. In other words, we all have sort of biases about certain things. You meet someone with a Southern accent, what immediately comes to mind? Southern US accent, what immediately comes to mind? Without even thinking about it. When you meet someone who is gay, what immediately comes to mind, right? Who's visible, right? And how do you respond in that situation? There's studies that show that in classrooms, professors are more likely to give more space and time to men answering questions than women answering questions. Do you think that that is a kind of a cognition that they are aware of? Absolutely not. It's built on their bias that we have. However, the more likely we have the interactions, the less our biases play out. So I'll give you a personal example, and then I'm gonna turn it over to my colleagues. I grew up in a non-religious home, right? My father went to college for 2 years, dropped out, joined the Navy, and ultimately felt that he could never kind of accomplish anything because he was Black. That's what his father told him, right? So there were a number of opportunities he had that he kind of decided not to pursue because he was Black, second generation Jamaican. But he made sure that his 4 kids never continued to have opportunities whenever he did, because he kind of circumscribed his opportunities there. My mother, born in Canada, from Bayesian background, Barbados background, et cetera, never went to college. So just want to give you the context for our household. My father had me say Massachusetts Institute of Technology when I was 3, by the way. So that's what I mean when he said, hey, I didn't get these opportunities, but I'm gonna make sure my kids have it. He introduced me to the notion of being an engineer when I was 5. Guess what? 2 degrees from MIT in engineering, right? You talk about typecasting the kids. Nevertheless, not a religious background, but in college, I got involved in a church and became much more, in a very serious way, kind of a believer, as we say it. And in that creates a mental model about certain things, including sexual orientation. So I had a belief that people who were gay chose to be that way. 15 years later, all through my life, I had this belief. One of my best friends came out. And not only he came out, but he told me he had HIV. And it just blew my mind. It just caused that aha moment, that cognitive dissonance I talked about. Just so happened we were going on vacation together. His wife and my wife and his wife. Yeah, the 4 of us, okay. And I spent a significant amount of time asking him a lot of questions. How did you know? When did you know? What was your first engagement? Why'd you do it? And it just changed my whole perspective about the LGBTQ community, about the choices one makes and whether or not they make a choice or not. Changed my whole perspective. Made me a better person. Soon after, my brother came out. The point is, these meaningful interactions where there's respect, mitigates our own biases that we carry, and ultimately creates a much more inclusive place for us to have. That's why it's so important that we have diversity and we have places where there are meaningful interactions, where teachers and others kind of create settings here where it's psychologically safe for you to kind of put yourself out there and try and learn and understand others in order to kind of be a better person and a better place to have a global impact. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague. Okay, I'll show a couple of things. Professor said I got to show some things to show that I've actually prepared. All right, where am I? All right, so I already shared with you the acronym. That's me when I graduated from college, yeah. And of course, I wrote a book called Working Smarter, Not Just Harder. It's about the research that I did, as well as some seminars, and that's me now. So it's not that much different. It's not bad, 40 years difference, not bad. That's who I work for. I work for Provost Madigan, and for President Aoun. I serve on the President's Cabinet. It's so very important that the Chief Inclusion Officer, Chief Diversity Officer have kind of high-level positions in any organization. If you are going to work for an organization and Chief Diversity Officer, one, doesn't exist, or two, doesn't report to senior levels, run like Forrest Gump, right? Just run, okay? Because organizations that have a commitment really place that commitment in senior positions as well. We made a commitment in June 2020 that we would be an organization, an anti-racist university, to eradicate racism and advance our commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion. These are the 9 things that were done as a result. We issued a report in July stating all the things that we've done thus far in terms of these 9 areas. It's a multidimensional approach to diversity, equity, inclusion. We've made a lot of progress, I'll share with you momentarily, but we've got a long way to go as a university, and that's part of my job. That's my job description. When I talk about creating an inclusive university, it is really using this definition that Catalysts use, which is a simultaneous experience of feeling of being valued for your uniqueness and having a sense of belonging on your team. So you are not a Black woman, right? You are not an Asian man. You are you, right? You're unique in that setting. And people value you for your uniqueness. That is the gold standard or the North Star that we're all working on, working to create. How do we approach this? We approach this by looking at 5 dimensions. 1, diversity, which is representation, as I talked about. 2 is equity. It's looking at our policies and practices, making sure they're equitable. Looking at salaries, looking at compensation, who gets hired, who gets fired in an organization, making sure that there are not sort of hidden inequities in all of this, in these areas. How are we related to the community? And this is what Professor Landsmark and I have been talking about, thinking about strategically, how do we kind of show up in the community, and how does the community kind of inform the work that we're doing as well as our partnerships. 4th is accountability. It's data, making sure that there's data available. There are dashboards available now on our website that shows the breakdown by race and ethnicity for faculty, staff, and students. We have to kind of show this accountability and build it into our systems. And then, of course, making inclusion a part of everything that we do as a university. So quickly, How are we going to do this? Some of you may have heard of a methodology called collective impact. Collective impact is our private-public partnerships that come together to solve complex problems. It might be an area eliminating childhood obesity, might increasing the number of kids who are prepared for kindergarten by age 5. It might even be making sure that more kids are ready for college in a city. Syracuse and Buffalo have that approach to collective impact. And so our collective impact brings together everyone and makes sure all the vectors are pointing on a common agenda, shared measurement metrics, which is how do we measure what we're getting at, mutually reinforcing activities so that making sure everybody's activities are pointing in the same direction, et cetera, et cetera. How are we doing? We're doing a lot, but we're still just seeing some impact. So the incoming freshman class, the current freshman class is the most diverse freshman class we've had in quite some years. We've also been able to hire roughly a third of all faculty hires this year were faculty of color. So once you create sort of intentionality, you start to see results, but we've got a long way to go as a university. I'll just say quickly, some of you may already have been aware of this, but starting on Monday or Tuesday, we'll be rolling out anti-racism training, a racial literacy, a cultural literacy training to the whole university. We started out with about 1,000 of the leadership of the organization of the university as well, and now it's going to all students, faculty, and staff. We discovered that our students do a really good job of appreciating and valuing their diversity. Graduate students better than undergraduates, but we can do a whole lot more. And that's what this training is intended to do. And so these are the 4 areas that you'll see in the modules starting next week. One of the areas that's really important is around privilege and power. And the other is how do we become anti-racist? And I saw that on the board here as well. In addition to that, we are going to be rolling out the results of the spring 2021 climate survey. We did a DEI climate survey across the university, and those results are available now. And we are planning on a series of rollouts, both the university-wide as well as within departments. And you'll hear more about that as well. 41,000 people were reached to do the survey, to participate in the survey, and you're going to see some phenomenal information that's there. So with that, we just have just kind of a notion about who's going to be doing this work, and we have a new office, the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion here at that I lead, and I work with a number of others across the university to advance faculty diversity, advance supplier diversity, staff diversity, student diversity, as well as strategic community engagement. And we're going to be doing that across the network. We're going to be doing research. We're going to be building on events and communications. We're going to be working on, as I mentioned, research, data modeling, as well as project management. So with that, I know I ran a lot longer because I didn't expect to do this, so I apologize for that. But hopefully the conversation will stimulate more questions from what I just shared. Thank you so much, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Richard O'Brien.
Good evening, everybody. I am Dr. Richard O'Brien, and it's actually sort of apropos that I'm going after Dr. Reid, because sometimes you see movies and then they come out with sort of the coming of age of how this character comes about. Well, what I'm going to do is take some time to talk about, yes, the John D. O'Brien African-American Institute, but it's rooted in how much Northeastern has changed and where it comes from. All right, there's 2 words with a marker, 2 words that I want you all to, I'm gonna use some of my science too, my engineering. All right. Anybody know what that word is? Inertia? What does inertia mean? Go ahead. Yep. It's good, good. Yeah, they teach us to remember it. Body at rest remains at rest. Body in motion remains in motion unless acted on by an outside force. All right, very good. How many people know what this formula means? What is that? Go ahead. Very good. You get an A. Force equals mass times acceleration. All right, the John Deere Bryan African-American Institute started more than 50 years ago. And Northeastern University in its early stages, was focused on working class folks that wanted to go to school. And it struggled with issues of diversity back then. But if you know anything about the 60s and even the 70s, it was a very difficult time for our country. It was a very difficult time for our college campuses. And it all seemed to culminate with the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King in 1968. And most college campuses were disrupted. Students, Black and white, by the way, decided they wanted to make a change. And so it was on Northeastern's campus. And so, eat the mic. All right, I know I got to talk, and I teach classes with students that are on Zoom, so I should know better. So the John Deere Bryan African-American Institute back then was the AfroAmerican Center, was founded in 1968. Now, the reason why I have you guys keep these words in mind is because what can happen to an organization is it gets into a mode of operation. And unless somebody does something, it won't change. It'll continue to do what it does until somebody changes it. And so in 1968, like all the other college campuses, Northeastern had Black students rise up and demand that the university pay attention to them, make some changes to help accommodate them, and to make it a safe place for them as students. And so in 1968, a group of students got together and issued 13 demands to the university. Now, the reason why this is important is because those 13 demands were never met. So they asked for things like more scholarships. They wanted 10% of the incoming class to be Black. They wanted more summer orientation programs to support as students come to Northeastern. They wanted to develop the Black Studies program, which my colleague, Dr. Jean-Charles, will talk about in a minute. They wanted independent student organizations that could represent them and advocate for them. They wanted to improve Black student retention. And they wanted to get support for work that the students wanted to do in the community. This was in 1968. So fast forward to 2020. Like the event that happened in 1968, the killing of George Floyd ended up being another one of those moments in our history. And not all the college campuses, but a lot of college campuses, students went into activation mode. They went into organizing mode. They went into protesting mode. So it was with our Northeastern students. As a matter of fact, the country was in protest mode. Public demonstrations. Well, what happened on our campus was students came together and organized themselves and wanted to talk to the administration about what they were going to do to make these changes on campus. And what the students intelligently did was they pulled out the original 13 demands from 1968. And this picture you see where we're having a conversation with President Ayoun, they were asking the question, why haven't these demands ever been met? Since 1968, the 10% of the incoming class demand was never met. Since 1968, the summer orientation and support programs was never met. Since 1968, nobody paid close attention to retention. So the students were savvy enough, smart enough, coy enough to say some of these things were never addressed. And to President Ayoun's credit, he listened. He listened. The chancellor listened, the provost listened. The students were speaking to whoever would listen in the administration. All of the student organizations got together and demanded that the university make some changes. And again, to the credit of Northeastern University, it was in a state of inertia for many, many years. And for some reason, 2020 changed everything. Now, granted, there was a movement throughout the country, so that the momentum was there, the energy was there. And just as you saw on my brother, Dr. Karl Reid's slide, shortly after these meetings with the student leaders, the president issued a statement and said, this is what the university is going to do. Now, mind you, President Ayoun has been president now, but about 12, 13 years, maybe even more than that. And the whole time that, and I've been here about the same time, a little longer, President Ayoun is very careful about making these kinds of public commitments. But he felt, and the administration felt, that it was important to make a bold statement with regards to what the university was planning to and willing to do. And so this year's incoming class, for the first time, is more than 10% of the incoming class. Now, anybody who understands statistics or mathematics, right? 10% of 1,000 students, is a big difference than 10% of 20,000 students. But the spirit of what students were asking for was, if you are going to be serious about diversity on this campus, you got to start with students that come in the door. Students demanded more faculty of color, they got more faculty of color. They demanded more support services like summer programs, Summer Bridge, which was traditionally just an engineering program with our brother, Dean Harris, now has become a campus-wide Summer Bridge program. And students wanted to make sure that there was resources there that they could stay, that they wanted to be retained. Now, granted, statistics show that the most common reason students leave, and it's usually after the first year, it's not necessarily money, and it's not necessarily academics. It's feelings of isolation, feelings of alienation. But what students believe was, if we can increase the total number of students coming in, Black students, then that will help to take care of itself, because students will feel less isolated, they'll feel more a part of the community, they'll feel less alienated. And so I'm going on a little long. So I have a video. Is the audio hooked up to it? Okay. Before I play it, let me just give it some context. All right. Now, the crazy thing is, all this stuff was happening during the pandemic. Right? So you see us doing the Zoom conversations with the president. That's because that's all we was doing to talk, right? And so while this was happening, the Institute, the John D. O'Brien African-American Institute, ever since its inception in '68, its primary function was to outreach to the students and make sure that they didn't feel isolated, that they didn't feel left. Well, it became extremely challenging during the pandemic because everybody was spread out, right? You couldn't have these events and activities, stuff where you bring everybody together. So you had to figure out how to engage them. Well, one of the things we wanted them to see was that the Institute wasn't going anywhere. And that even though we had this pandemic going on, we wanted them to know that we were here and available as a resource for them. Now, how do I just click it? Okay. I swear it's a short video. Audio. Legacy, excellence, culture, unity, success, service. These words define the John D. O'Brien African-American Institute at Northeastern University. The tradition lives on. For the first time in the Institute's 50-year history, the space we all love is gone silent. This unprecedented semester and year has ended. And when we get past this time of uncertainty, the Institute will be here and alive again, the voices, the energy, our students, our alumni, our staff, our faculty, and our community. We have overcome a lot in history. This time will be no different. The darkness will pass, the sun will rise, and together we will get through this. So one of the, I'm sorry, did I mess it up? So in my conclusion, and I can't say enough about how important it is for my two colleagues that are here today, and I was just saying to somebody, I don't know if maybe Ted knew what he was doing and said, let me get these three together. Because the three of us in our roles here at Northeastern, we turn them out to probably 3/5 of the important Black people on campus, right? So, but as a result of all that was happening, and I want to say since 1968, but I can't say for certain that when students in 1968, they saw Northeastern becoming what it is today. But a big reason why you see the activity that's happening today is a direct result people like Karl, people like Regine, that are making a big difference in what's happening on our campus right now. And I can tell you right now, in 1968, if we would have told them students then, Northeastern would make Juneteenth a holiday. How many of y'all know what Juneteenth is? 1968. I can tell you right now, they would have said, you're right, you're crazy. Northeastern ain't never gonna make. Karl, Dr. Reid championed that cause. And in June, for the first time, we celebrated the fact that Northeastern agreed for Juneteenth to be a holiday. Moreover, the reason why this is important, the graduating class of 2021, was because we had that gap. Right? We did some virtual stuff with the class of 2020, but it wasn't the same. And they represented, and I told them this, they represented the return. They represented the rising of the sun that I talked about in that video. Because everybody had felt so bad about being away, and they weren't sure if we were ever going to get back to some semblance of normalcy. Now, granted, the 2020 class, thank goodness, next month we will be celebrating them. They'll have their commencement, and we're going to have something for them as well. But the importance of the role and responsibility that the three of us serve is making sure that these students stay. And the numbers that I saw around retention, I haven't had a chance to talk to universities' research about it, but all of the indicators are that retention is up across all races, across the university. And the reason why it's up is because people feel something about what's happening at Northeastern, and they want to stay here. And they want to be a part of what's happening and the change that's occurring. And so last thing, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. John Charles. When the students had those 13 demands, and they wanted an African-American studies program, one emerged out of the effort of the starting of the Institute, created a department, but it ran into some difficulty several years ago. I mean, to the point when the university was considering getting rid of the African-American Studies department. Well, our sister, Dr. Nicole Aljo, she was originally on the search committee, and they said, well, why don't you do it? And she did. And she stewarded it, stabilized it, helped to build back up the course offerings, attracted some wonderful faculty to Northeastern University. And we are so appreciative of the fact that Dr. Nicole Aljo has gone on to sabbatical, well-deserved, mind you, because she was working. And in her stead, in her replacement, Dr. Regine John Charles has joined us and is now leading the Africana Studies program. And we're excited about where it's going to go and what it's going to do and the kind of impact that it's going to have. So without further ado, I will turn it over to my colleague.
That was a seamless transition. How are we doing, everyone? Good. I won't be as long as my colleagues. I won't say why. My name is Dr. Regine Jean-Charles, and I'm so pleased to be here. I'm the Dean's Professor of Culture and Social Justice, as well as a Professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and the Director of Africana Studies. I don't have any slides, but I am going to take you through some images from our website of the Africana Studies program. And I'm so happy that Richard went before me so that he could lay out some of that history. I'm going to talk about a few things. I'll talk about what we're doing in Africana Studies. I'll talk about what my vision is and what I would like us to do. But before I do that, I do want to talk about the importance of Black studies as a discipline and as a field to Black freedom, to Black liberation, to the advancement of activism of Black students and the well-being of Black students on college campuses. So as you saw with the example that Richard gave of Northeastern, the Black Studies Department, it was originally a department that they asked for right in the 13 demands. I saw you put program up there. You got to put department back because people need to know. So in 1968, when the students at Northeastern made their 13 demands, one of the demands was for an African-American Studies department, which they did have, but as Richard explained about 5 years ago, was reconfigured, and now what we have is an Africana Studies program. What's the difference between a department and a program? Does anyone know? You look like you know in the green, my friend. Go ahead. In general, departments have more financial backing, more institutional power, and they get, lines from the dean's office. So generally, they're more kind of stable, right? So that's an important point, just that I want you to hold on to. So Northeastern was not alone, as Richard also pointed out. During the 1960s, all over the United States, there was this confluence of events that took place. Students were protesting in 1968 after the death of Martin Luther King. Students were protesting just in general, right? The scourge of systemic racism, as we saw. So there was this active culture of student protest, right? And so out of those Black student protests also came the emergence of the first Black Studies departments. The very first one was at San Francisco State in California. And it's fascinating when you look at that history, it also dovetails with the Watts riots that were happening in California in 1965, right? So a scholar that I admire and adore, Robin D.G. Kelley, has a beautiful essay called Black Struggle, Black Study for the Boston Review, which she wrote a few years ago. And he explains that the fight for freedom in the streets is inextricably related to the fight for freedom on college campuses. He ties together the Watts Rebellion of 1965 and the emergence of African-American Studies departments in the UC system and throughout California. And so what's important for us to think about is how this idea of Black study relates to Black struggle, right? So again, I'm a Black Studies scholar, so I did my undergrad in African-American Studies. I did my PhD. Was an undergrad at the University of Pennsylvania, and then I did my master's and my doctorate at Harvard University. And Black Studies has always been a thread that just goes all throughout of my own intellectual formation, right? Before I was here, I was at the university. I was at Boston. Well, before I was there, I was at the University of Virginia, where I did a postdoc at the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African-American Studies. And then prior to coming here, I was at Boston College for 12 years, where we had an African Diaspora Studies program. I'm the child of Haitian immigrants, and I'm a Black feminist scholar. And so all of my work really thinks about intersectionality, and also the local and global ways in which we can engage Black study, okay? That's just a little background on me. So Black studies was not just conceived in the university, but it was also related to what was happening outside of the university, right? So we see a thread where we can't just stay in here. And this is a great thing, when I came to Northeastern, I actually wrote in my director's welcome, I said, there's actually no better place to do Black studies, because if you think about Northeastern's, where's my thing? There we go, yep. If we think about Northeastern, that's me, that's a big picture of me, hi. So if we think about, and I encourage you to read this, because part of what I'm talking about is social justice, right? And the importance of social justice as being central to Black studies and Africana studies. So if we think about the tradition out of which this field emerged, it was always engaged in the community. It was never just in the ivory tower. Similarly, if we think about Black feminism, right? And if we think about intersectionality as a lens and what it means to think about the marginalized identities in tandem with one another, right? That's really what intersectionality is. It's a lens, right? If we think about that, there's always a social justice component to it. So we can't talk about the beginning of Black studies or African American studies here at Northeastern without talking about social justice and community engagement. We can't talk about our field at all without talking about social justice and community engagement. We can't talk about Black feminism without talking about social justice and community engagement. Robin Kelly reminds us, and I love the metaphor of struggle that he uses. He says, struggle is people's rigorous engagement with each other and differing ideas of freedom. Struggle, I like struggle as a more expansive term for how it links to the idea of freedom broadly conceived, right? So we think about freedom as the goal, right? We want everybody to be free. Fannie Lou Hamer said, nobody's free until everybody's free, right? And so that means in our fight for social justice, or however we're engaging the movements for social justice, the way that we will know that we have an impact is when everybody is free. Right? And so that means that all of our freedoms are bound to one another. Now, for Black study, that's something that's essential to the way that we teach in Africana studies. We are teaching students the history of racism. We are teaching students how creators, so I'm a literature scholar, so this is my jam right here, is how writers and creators have addressed the scourge of systemic racism, right? When you read a novel like Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, and it starts out with this, See Dick and Jane Play, See Dick and Jane Play. If you haven't read The Bluest Eye, beautiful, beautiful novel by Toni Morrison, her first novel, in fact. It's about this little Black girl who wants to have blue eyes, dark-skinned little Black girl who believes she is ugly, and that if only she would have blue eyes, her life would be better. Her father also rapes her, right? So it's a survivor narrative story. Much of my work is on the intersection of sexual violence and racial violence. And in that book, we see how in a little girl's brain, when she reads Dick and Jane, you probably don't know about Dick and Jane because I barely read Dick and Jane and I'm 43, but my older sisters did. But Dick and Jane were these little books that they had, right, growing up in schools. Dick and Jane were a little white girl with blonde hair, and that was Jane, and Dick was her friend or her brother, right? Dick and Jane, but they had their house with their parents and they were happy. And so it was basically what we call an undecolonized curriculum, right? That students, this is why we need critical race theory. This is why we need to teach these things in our classrooms, because these Black students were learning about Dick and Jane and internalizing oh, Dick and Jane, I don't look like Dick and Jane. I must be ugly. My family is not like Dick and Jane, right? So Toni Morrison writes this beautiful novel about this little Black girl who wants blue eyes and who believes she has no worth in the world because she is Black, right? This is a way that Toni Morrison is teaching us about racism and how it operates and the toll that it takes on the psyche. And what's beautiful about our field, especially when you look at literature and art and visual culture, is that creators of the African diaspora, and when I say African diaspora, that means everybody Black, right? Issa Rae, I'm voting for everybody Black, that's everybody Black, right? So African Americans, people in the Caribbean, Black Europe, Africans, Black Asians, right? They exist. So that's, when I say African diaspora, I use that term to talk about all of us, right? And so all of these artists and creators and writers and intellectuals and theorists, they are addressing racism in different ways. They're doing it with an intersectional lens. They're doing it in the way that Audre Lorde does when she tells us that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, right? That's Audre, right? Snaps, thank you, my brother. That's Audre Lorde telling us that, guess what, when we look at our oppressions, we have to figure out a way to dismantle these oppressions without repeating the same thing that's been done to us. That means that when we talk about feminism, we're not just saying, oh, okay, let's just replace the patriarchy with the matriarchy, although some people think that is false, okay? So all of our, these thinkers that we introduce students to in Africana studies, whether it's in a class like mine on gender and Black world literature, hi Daphne, it's so nice to see you here. If you want to know more about that class, she can tell you because she's in it. Whether it's in a class like mine about gender and Black world literature, or a class like my friend Meredith Clark's Black popular culture, right, which is a great class also through CAMD. That's jointly CAMD and CSSH. Or classes about epidemiology in Kenya, right? In Nairobi, like my colleague Richard Wamai is doing. He's taking a lens, a social justice lens, to thinking about health and inequity and what does that look like, right? In the context of Kenya, in the context of other parts of the African continent as well. So we have a number of classes that are really engaging these questions and showing us how we can intellectually unpack the well-known kind of long-standing issues with racism, with sexism, why diversity is important. We've been doing this for a long time. And what Black study and Black struggle show us is that the two require each other. And I would say that a hinge, so if we look at, so we have Black study and we have Black struggle, right? And I think that social justice is really what holds them all together. And community engagement is what holds them all together. So I said I wasn't going to go as long, right? Maybe I was lying. Okay, so today actually one of my students brought to my attention that fact about the 13 demands and the fact that this is the first time that there has ever been 10% of African-American students or students of the African diaspora, right? It's not just students of color, right? It's Black students, right? Correct. So that's 53 years later, right? So again, for me, I really take seriously the idea of social justice movements, the role of social justice in Black study, right? And so how are we doing this at Northeastern? Oh, sorry. One thing that I was going to say is that, so the theme that I've selected for this year is actually Reimagining Together. And the reason why I selected this theme is because number one, as you know, as I said earlier, I really believe in the role of the imagination as something that can inspire us, that propels us forward, that can animate our justice work. I really, I say this all the time, but I'm the child of Haitian immigrants. And so I come from a people who had to imagine what it meant to be free, right? They were enslaved. It was the first Black republic in the Western Hemisphere. It was the first place and the only place where enslaved Africans and formerly enslaved Africans together were able to break the yoke of slavery through a successful revolution, right? So they had to imagine that. They didn't know what it was like for generations. And many of them died before they could even see that freedom, right? Toussaint Louverture, who I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he was the first general of the Haitian Revolution. He died in France before it ended. Poor Toussaint Louverture, because he actually believed, he used to write letters to Napoleon that would say, to the first of the whites, from the first of the Blacks. Like, he really believed himself entirely equal. I believe he was too, but Napoleon didn't think that. So he thought he was going to negotiate with the French, like, oh, they've invited me so that I can come and discuss with them the terms of our freedom. They put him in jail as soon as he got there. And so Toussaint Louverture continued to write these letters. And one of the letters that he wrote, I love to cite it because he said, by cutting me down, by capturing me, you have cut down the tree of liberty, but its roots are deep and my people will see their freedom, right? So even though he died, he had this imagination of that freedom would be realized despite the fact that he never lived to see it. So the imagination is really important to everything that we do in our field of Africana studies. It's important in our justice work. A lot of my work is in the movement to end gender-based violence. And we talk about, imagining a world without sexual violence. What would that look like? That would mean that you could walk down the street and that no one would harass you. No one would street harass you, right? That would mean that these statistics where we know that 1 out of 5 women on college campuses will be raped, that doesn't exist anymore. That means that we wouldn't have to have these trainings anymore, right? So, Reimagining Together, I am so indebted to my colleague and my friend, Nicole Aljo, who really laid a great foundation for Africana studies. And among the many excellent things that she did, there were a lot of community engaged projects. So for example, under her directorship, there were several independent student projects supported by the Office of City and Community Affairs. There was one focused on the experiences of Somali youth with a series of BPD workshops that was intended to dissuade religious radicalization. There was another that was a photography project focused on Ethiopian immigrant communities around the globe, including Boston. We have a big Ethiopian community here in Boston. In fact, if you go to the hallways of Renaissance Park on the second floor where my office is, you can come visit me and you'll see some of those photographs around there. It's a beautiful exhibition. They also did a number of workshops focusing on creating art with the Boys and Girls Clubs. And they hosted Black literacy workshops for public school teachers in conjunction with local universities. So these were all excellent programs. And I think it's so important for Africana studies especially to have a presence in the community. But what I'm interested in terms of my vision is less so kind of projects here and there, but a sustained and committed engagement, right? So I'll tell this one story that's kind of an example of what I think we can do. And then we can imagine together what are some of the other things we can do in Africana studies. So I didn't even show you all like half the things I wanted to show you, but these are our learning outcomes here. But what I really wanted to show you were some of the programs that we did. Let me see if we go to students, there we go. So last year, there was an event called See Us, Hear Us, Understand Us. And my student, Savita Maharaj, was one of the organizers of that. Savita works in the office. And so, if you go to the website, you can kind of see that there's a video of the event somewhere, which I can't find, so I'm not going to waste time. But, here we kind of see a story about someone who's from Boston. She went to Boston Latin, and who was using her time at Northeastern to focus on Africana studies and English, but who's also using the connections she has within the Boston community to be engaged in the community, right? And to approach her work from a perspective that is centered on justice and that looks at community engagement through a decolonizing lens. What does that mean? When I say community engagement through a decolonizing lens, I mean we're not going in there to save the children of Roxbury, right? We're not going in there to just give them all of our knowledge and tell them everything that we have and we're gonna make an impact, right? We're not doing that. What we're doing is a community-centered approach that starts with, well, what do you all need, right? What can Northeastern do better? And so the example that I'll give to you for my vision of this comes from an experience that I had for many years. I worked with an organization called A Long Walk Home. Look up their website, they're excellent. A Long Walk Home, whose mission is to empower artists to end gender-based violence. And A Long Walk Home began as we were doing, so it was founded by two sisters. And the two sisters, one of them is a rape survivor and the other one is an artist. And when the sister disclosed to her sister her experience with sexual violence, her little sister wanted to document it. So she started taking photographs of her. And it just became this, photographic exhibition. And one of her professors, the photographer, said to her, you should do something else with this. So she turned it into a multimedia arts performance and added music, added dancing, added people acting out, reading poems that her sister, the survivor, had written. And it became this thing that traveled all over the country. And I was a part of it. I did some acting in it. And we would travel to universities all over the country. This was when we were in grad school, so we had a little bit more time. But we would travel to universities all over the country. We went to Chicago, we went to Kentucky, we went to Dartmouth. We went all over the country and we would do this performance about Black women and sexual assault. And what we realized, so the woman who's the photographer, she moved to Chicago for a job. And she started working as a high school health educator. And she realized as she was working with these young women in Chicago, between the ages of 14 and 17, in an urban community, that many of them were dealing with teen dating violence, right? And so there are forms of violence that really we weren't addressing as an organization that we felt important to address. And so we started this program called the Girlfriends Program. And the Girlfriends Program is it was first youth enrichment, but really youth empowerment program that uses the arts to train girls, teenage girls, to tell their stories about sexual violence or how they've encountered violence in their communities, but to come up with solutions. Oh, I have to end. So they have to come up with solutions, right? And that's a model later on, we ended up partnering with the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. And it's been an ongoing, we're now, I think, 11 years or 12 years into the project. So the point is this, that project has been going on for 12 years. We didn't find a university partner until maybe 5 years in. And seeing those girls go from the south side of Chicago, never going into the kind of main parts of Chicago, seeing their experiences on a college campus, seeing how it changed their worldview, seeing as how it directly had an impact, right, on what they wanted to do, is something that taught me that community engagement really has to start, really can be activated by the youth. And that's all I'll say, because I've stopped.
Professor Kaufman.
Well, thanks very much. That was really fascinating. And I think, exploring the depths of what's being offered academically and in terms of kind of structural issues, I think is really important. I wanted to turn the focus a little bit to the question of the campus climate. Richard, you've been here the longest probably. And then we have sort of two relative newcomers. Maybe, Karl, you can share with us a preview of the climate survey, because I'm interested in what your sense is, both anecdotally, but also from a data point of view of what the climate is at Northeastern. We spend part of our class with students talking about microaggressions they've encountered in class as well. A really interesting discussion about the role of fraternities on campus here and what that's fueling. So I'm wondering what the data is showing, but then also the three of you kind of what you think the temperature of campus is these days and maybe where it's headed.
Yeah. Yeah, so the climate survey shows that first of all, we have the data that looks at Northeastern compared to 300 and other institutions that took the same survey. So the first thing is, how does Northeastern look compared to those institutions? And we find that we are more diverse than those other institutions in general, especially with the international, 21% international, compared to other schools is about 9 or 10%. More students who respond identifies LGBTQ than other institutions on average. We are less religious than other institutions on average as well. So we wanted to see how we looked. Secondly, we wanted to see how individual groups experience the climate here. So overall, we have a very high positive DEI climate here. Something in the order of 72% of the community feel positive, satisfied, or very satisfied about the DEI climate. And a significant percentage of the population sees the value of diversity, something in the order of 90%, which is great. However, there are several groups that have different experiences here. One, African-American, Latinx, tend to hear disparaging comments about their race and ethnicity much more so than other groups. LGBTQ and transgender tend to hear more and discriminated against more here on campus as well. Disabled, temporary, permanently disabled, tend to, again, to experience things differently, and the climate is not as welcoming as well. And here's an interesting one, politically conservative. Those who are here on campus feel that they are sort of marginalized on campus as well. So part of our strategy will be to reach out to those groups and create more avenues for connection and this feeling a sense of belonging on campus. Those are the same groups that report very low sense of belonging on campus as well. Being proactive in reaching out to those. So in general, it's positive, though if you kind of pull out below the surface, you see significant areas of disparities that we have to address. The number one place is sources of discrimination and harassment, students. Second is faculty. And third is the community. So again, there's some education that we can provide for students as well as faculty and community going forward.
Professor Jean-Charles, you spent time studying in Virginia. You were at Boston College, across the city. One of the students said when we were asking about their own experiences, he said, I came from Texas and I thought no place could be worse than Texas. And Boston is worse than Texas. So I'm wondering what your sense is, both, having been in Virginia, but also at BC, kind of how things are, how things shake out here.
Yeah, so I did a postdoc at UVA, so I was only there for 1 year. And I will say I did I went to Harvard and Penn, so I was very much like Northern in my orientation of, graduate school and undergrad. So I should also say I grew up in Massachusetts. So my personal experience with this question is a bit unfair because I'm Haitian. And I remember going to college and people would say, oh, Boston, oh, there are no Black people there. And I'm like, I'm Haitian. There are actually quite a few of us. But my experience of this question is really largely through a lot of friends that I have, right, who come here and they experience the isolation and they are excited. They try to flee. But what I have found is that what really makes a difference in Boston in terms of the racial climate for people is the community having a sense of belonging through community, right? So being in churches together, Black church has been a huge source of community for people. Organizations, social organizations within the Black community. So I'm the wrong person to ask basically, because I'm like, Boston isn't that bad, but I've been here, for most of my life. And I do think, there is, even Martin Luther King said that no one is more dangerous than the white liberal, right? Because I think that what happens in Boston with racism is a lot of times we have well-meaning, woke, social justice-oriented white liberals who are also racist, right? Who are not being actively anti-racist. And I think that there's this stereotype that like in the South, it's more explicit, but here it's subtle. It's the microaggressions, which are equally harmful, is what I always say.
Dr. O'Brien, the Institute does a lot, but it's also very plugged into the social life of African-American students here. And I guess I wanted to toss you the fraternity question because it was something that I thought was intriguing. There were comments, again, that people have made over the years about exclusionary parties and things like that. And I'm kind of wondering what your sense is about where we are, where we need to go, and things that may be troubling you about what's developing.
I think the challenge we have is it's shifting from racial to political, and it's the evidence of that is, when the election happened and when Trump was running against Hillary Clinton, Northeastern did a poll, you remember, and Trump won. To a lot of people's surprise. But what it revealed for the Northeastern campus was they didn't quite understand the depth of the political ideology on campus, and it ran deep. And what I find is that students, they don't isolate so much around race, but they isolate each other around issues, around political ideology. And I teach in the political science department, and I taught an urban politics class. And I had some students, this was during when George Bush was president, and he was the boogeyman. And there was about 7 or 8 students in my class that would not say a word. And then one day, one of them came up to me after class and he said, Professor O'Brien, I don't want you to think we're not interested in participating. It's just that we believe that students with conservative views are not welcomed. And so the next class, I changed what I had planned to teach for that day, and we talked about tolerance, and we talked about difference, and we talked about understanding. And the conservative students appreciated it so much. They became more engaged and started talking because, I allowed disagreement to happen in the classroom. And the point of it is some of the things we think students are, that's keeping students separated, may not necessarily be the things that's actually keeping them separated. The social life, I see Black students and white students. I mean, I don't go to student parties, but my sense is that they still engage socially with each other. Although Black students do stuff among themselves, but I don't see the racial animosity with regards to social life like you might think. And it seems to be some other stuff driving it. And some of our students tell us that social media and the kind of visceral communications that are happening online, they can degenerate into racial issues, but they usually start out as political issues, and so we gotta get our hands around what's really at work, at play here. And a lot of it is stuff under the surface that we may not necessarily know or understand.
Okay, why don't we turn to the students now? If you
Yeah,
have a question
students.
or you want to share some of your thoughts or experiences. And while we get that set up, I'll go to Professor Landsmark.
I wanted to go to the students.
Thank you so much for speaking with us and for all your presentations. I have a question for you, Dr. Reid. How prepared is Northeastern's administration for any potential backlash regarding the anti-racism training?
We spend quite a bit of time preparing the community for the training. A couple of ways we've done that. First of all, the training is custom. So we listen to the community and develop the training. So again, matching the units. What does the community need and how do we customize the training? Two, we held a series of focus groups during the summer with students, faculty, and staff, and not just the yes men, women, or they, right? We just wanted to hear from them about the detailed outlines and to get feedback. And we've adjusted the training as a result of that. We're going to invariably get pushback on the training. We got pushed. I mean, I heard it quite a bit, an earful about the sexual harassment training, right? And most of the complaints of the sexual harassment training is not the content, it's just the amount of time that it's taking. Well, you know what? There's a lot of time that's taken if the university gets sued or if the experiences of women on campus are not favorable and they end up leaving, in a lot of ways. So, we've got to address it, but we have really listened to the community as we plan the rollout. That's why the rollout is staged, because we felt that it was important. The first group were those who can provide resources. The second group are the managers and supervisors. So anybody who has management supervisory responsibility, get the training next. And now the rest of the community. So the belief is that we have done the proper steps, but invariably, as Professor Kaufman said, you're going to get blowback, and we're prepared for that. We are prepared to respond in a positive way, provide feedback, and then have smaller conversations around the university about the training to get more feedback and to stimulate more conversations.
Can I add a little bit to that? Since Regine called out one of her students, Michelle, that video you all saw, I mean, not the video, the images you all saw of students meeting with the president and the students who were organized, Michelle was one of those student leaders. Yep, I know. I didn't want to embarrass her, but yeah, you can give her a round of applause. Yep, made a big difference. And I'm glad you asked that question, Michelle, because what we can't be afraid of is what might happen or could happen or even does happen, right? Progress is only going to happen if we stick with what we know is what we want to happen here at Northeastern, despite the resistance, and I always use the Edmund Pettus Bridge example. with John Lewis, right? John Lewis could have quit after that Edmund Pettus Bridge thing, but he didn't, right? He kept pushing and he kept the faith, and and how much change and difference has he made? You know, I mean, he's passed and gone from us now, but if he had quit when that happened on Edmund Pettus Bridge, what the things that he impacted with his life and the work that he did. And so as we try to get over this hurdle, you know, we just have to be prepared to not give up. You know, just like you all as students, you know, you don't give up in the face of all the adversity. You just keep pushing forward, you know, but you just have to be savvy. And one of my favorite sayings is you don't have to swing at every pitch, right? Because people are gonna throw stuff at you. And you know, we gotta be prepared to hang in there and see this thing through.
Cool. Thank y'all so much for your presentation and insights. It's kind of like a two-parter question. So as you know, last week there was an anti-Semitic act involving a mezuzah at Northeastern Hillel. I was curious if you could explain the process through which universities respond to these types of incidents, as well as what Northeastern's planning to do to support Jewish communities on campus in wake of this anti-Semitic act.
Yeah, this is very important conversation. So first of all, the university did reach out to the Jewish American community almost immediately. One of the senior officers had contact with Hillel about the experience. So the first response is, how are you doing, right? It has to be a genuine, empathetic question of how you are doing in the experiences. Second is an investigation, right? What happened? Who did it? How do we kind of resolve it? Because there's a penalty to be paid for tearing down the mezuzah as well in that community. And the third is sort of thinking about sort of strategy going forward. Our approach typically is listen, learn, plan, and act. To listen, how are you doing? Kind of empathetically, genuinely, et cetera. Learn from the community. Most of us didn't know much about the mezuzah and its significance. So kind of increase that education, but increase education about anti-Semitism as well. And then sort of develop the plan. We applied this same approach with the Asian American community around the anti-Asian hate that started to arise over the course of the pandemic years, and especially kind of that moment that Richard talked about with George Floyd was March 6th with the massage parlors and the 6 Asian women that was killed. And the Asian community kind of rose up, Asian American community rose up and said, we need to really, they put in their 13 demands, although it was 73 pages long, and said, this is what the university needs to do. There should be a response. We did respond. We had an event. I put together an action plan with Ken Henderson, the chancellor, and we rolled out that action plan, and that action plan is continuing as well. We'll do the same thing with the Jewish American community as well, the Jewish community as well. Understand what that action plan is. So last night we had an hour with the community to understand sort of how they're doing, what kinds of things we need to put in place and how we respond. And what we heard was there needs to be a general education in the university about anti-Semitism. And what we also heard is there needs to be increased empathy about the experiences of the Jewish American community. I would argue that that's the case for other communities as well. And so we're putting together strategies to reach out to those communities as well in anticipation before something like this happens.
Was there also a part of your question though about a reporting system? Did I hear that correctly, or did I make that up? Okay. Got it. Okay.
Okay, I have I would say probably like 2 pieces of one question. So the first one is for Dr. Karl. So before the president made the commitment, so I'm sure there is most people from management were probably not as diverse as they would hope of. So now, how you plan to integrate new people, or like, what's the turnaround plan for over time to get that management, the upper management more diverse? So that's the first one. And second one is for Regine. So in Boston, like you alluded to, there's a lot of organization from Roxbury to Mattapan. So how do university plan to get outside the four walls to actually get into the community so that people can know more about the African studies and actually get them to be part of the, to get more people locally to be part of the larger plan for the African study that you try to run?
Sure, I'll go first. Well, one of the ways that I did this at Northeastern, at Boston College, was through classes. And so I'm hoping in Africana Studies that we can have a really robust, not just service learning, but a service learning requirement for the majors and the minors. And I think it works really well. So one of the communities that I did a lot of work with is the Haitian community. And so we worked with Association Femmes Haitiennes Boston, which is a very reputable organization in Mattapan that is working around the needs of Haitian women and children specifically. And also they do a lot around refugees. And so I found that, what I did in my classes was I had students, the students would have to go there physically, right? So they would have to go to AFAB in Dorchester from, at the time, Chestnut Hill, where I was teaching. And they had to do whatever AFAB needed them to do that semester. And maybe, there was one semester where AFAB said, well, we need a website. So the students created a website. There was another semester where they said, we need a video, right? And so I'm looking to do the same thing with students in Africana Studies. And what really matters is that you have people that have relationships. So because I had a relationship with AFAB, they trusted me, right? And so that when my students came in, they said, these are Dr. Jean-Charles students. So we're going to, they came with a kind of that reputation. Similarly, I did a lot of work with the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center where it was the same thing. So my model is always, you are going to the organization to see what they need done, right? And then you just have to do it. I don't care if they tell you that they just need someone to sweep every day for the entire semester. And so that's really my model of community engagement, that it has to be centered on the needs of the organization. And so I'm planning to implement that for Africana Studies, that there will be a requirement for students who are majors and minors in the program. And we also have some other service learning classes actually that Ted can talk about too.
I'll just say that on Friday morning, December 3rd, a number of us are coming together. You're invited to that at Egan to assemble campus thinking on campus engagement with communities in ways that can lead to more co-creation and more supportive work on the part of all of us involved with the community, and less of a use of the community purely for research purposes. So Friday morning, the 3rd of December, we'll have an extended conversation on precisely that subject.
And that very point, and really, please don't lose those 2 points that were made. Professor Landsmark called it co-creation, which is working alongside someone to come up with the solutions that benefit the community, right? Rather than what Professor Jean-Charles talked about is a kind of a colonial approach that says, we have the solution, we're gonna fix you. That's not the approach. Louis Moll wrote a paper some years ago, probably my first year in my doctoral program, called The Funds of Knowledge. And he talks about how effective teachers know how to pull out the funds of knowledge every student brings into the classroom. The very first step of an excellent teacher is to understand and leverage the funds of knowledge that the students bring in. And the teacher learns from that funds of knowledge. That fund of knowledge becomes a substrate to teach new content. It's a constructivist approach versus assuming that you are empty vessels as students and I'm going to pour everything I know into you, right? It's basically going into the community and understanding what is unique and gifted and the attributes of this community. And then bringing what Northeastern does well, which is experiential learning, which is a research discipline, and faculty, in fact, also a lot of resources as well to actually catalyze the work that you're doing. So it's a different mindset Now, one of the things that I hope to bring to the equation is, what's the so what? If we go into a community, what's the so what? So 5 people get jobs, and 3 people get some funding, and 2 kids get scholarships. What's the so what? What I hope to bring is an answer to that question. What's the 5-year plan? What is the long-term vision for an engagement? What will this look like after 3 to 5 years, in order to really transform and benefit the university, transform the university and benefit our community and our partnerships. And so I'd love to get to a point where we actually have a big compact, a big vision with Roxbury and other communities in this area, and also in Portland, and also in Charlotte, and where we are and operating, to understand what those needs are, and then build toward that over the next 5 years. That's the vision of an inclusive university and a participatory partner in the community, not someone that's going to save it. Now, to your quick question, the other question is, yes, I've had conversations with the president and others about the leadership of the organization, right, and the diversity of the organization, and he is aware that the optics don't look good, right, for our university. And in fact, more and more of our funders are saying, what is the makeup of your board? What is the makeup of your senior leadership team? And what are you going to do about it in order to create more diversity? That has to be a part of the overall strategy, the blueprint that I talk about for inclusive excellence, to address that and move us toward a more inclusive leadership as well. And why is that the case? This is not just the optics of the university. It's because we get better as a result of having more diverse perspectives, more identity diversity, as well as other kinds of diversity of the leadership. So that's an effort that we're going to be kind of having a conversation about as part of the blueprint that the president asked me to put together over the next few months.
Hi, thank you so much for your time tonight. So I have kind of a 2-part question. The first being, it feels like a lot of the efforts towards diversity are like university-wide or even college-wide, but in places like the College of Arts, Media and Design, you have a lot of programs that are a lot smaller. So for example, the journalism program, which I'm a part of. And so my question is, how do you target a very low rate of diversity in those kind of programs that may not respond in the same way to how, college-wide efforts are? And then the second part being, around my second year, I interviewed journalism students of color about how they felt about the lack of diversity in this journalism school. And hopefully I'm not, putting you on the spot, Professor Kaufman, but I was able to speak with him, and he said, it's important to have a more diverse student body and a more diverse faculty. But he didn't see it necessary to incorporate diversity into every class, because the way the journalism school worked was it was required courses that are focused on skill building and ethics. And instead, diversity, electives had, tackled issues like race and otherwise. But from my own opinion, and for other journalism students of color, if diversity is confined to special courses, students who simply choose not to take those courses can graduate having no kind of understanding of diversity at all, or students, especially white students, will just choose not to take that course. So I just wanted to ask in regard to both what your thoughts are on that, all of you.
Maybe I'll go first. I was wrong. I think George Floyd changed a lot of views. And I think, I was pretty liberal. I think I had a track record of writing about race, but I think, in the wake of George Floyd, we had a lot of conversations about how we teach. So concretely, what's come out of that is that when I got here, we had no African Americans, no faculty of color, actually. In the journalism school, we now have 3 faculty who are African American, as well as folks from Indian American, Korean American, but that's less. The issue is really, and we have a tenured faculty of like 15 people. So 3 out of 15 is pretty good, I think. It doesn't mean we stopped there, but we moved, I think, fairly seriously towards that. And, contrary to what I said, and I was wrong in retrospect, we have decided to incorporate diversity into all our classes. And part of that is either in the assignments we ask students to do, but also I think to think about, and I think this is part of what happened with George Floyd, was thinking about, they always talk about the male gaze when you're talking about women and feminist studies. And so, we had a lot of conversations about the white gaze and how many of the priorities that we set are actually set by, in my generation, white editors, white reporters, white publishers who decided this is what we should be covering. And so one of the things we're doing now is making active decisions that say, no, we've got to look at things differently. And we've brought in speakers to address that, Wes Lowery, and there'll be others. So, I think I'm proud in a way. I mean, as I think most in the country feel, it was terrible that it took the murder of someone captured on a cell phone to make us have this conversation. But we had the conversation. And I think, as part of what you were saying about how the president responded and how the university is responding and how I personally responded, I think it was a wake-up call. And I think the key thing is that, there's a sense of action after it, that you're held accountable, right? It's not just that we feel bad, but like, okay, show me the numbers, show me what's happening. I mean, we're in the middle now, we've just raised $100,000 for a scholarship that's going to be earmarked for a student of color. I mean, there are just ways in which we're trying to address it. So, so in that sense, I don't have a problem saying that my answer would have been different 2 years ago. And sadly, it took George Floyd to make me give a different answer.
I'll just add that for some departments, it was fairly easy to look at curricula and syllabi and reading lists and to really dig down into every class to determine the ways in which there was biased teaching going on. It's pretty easy in the School of Public Policy because we're always out and engaged. And so we started that process earlier, but it was more difficult for other departments. There's no question of that. And it's been fairly easy for some departments to say, this whole business of social justice just doesn't apply in our area. But there are a lot of things happening outside the university that are changing that view. Facebook, all of the discrimination that we've seen in terms of the development of algorithms, the shaming of young women, a number of biases. And it was only yesterday that I had a presentation to our chemical engineering department, where traditionally people don't think that issues of social justice would apply, except that we got to talking about resilience, we got to talking about environmental justice, we got to talking about food deserts and distribution systems. So I think that the school is, the university is beginning to see that all of the curricula need a very rigorous review. And obviously, the university has a very long way to go in this regard.
And the only other thing, and there are a couple of questions here, but the only thing that I'll say is that, and Professor Kaufman talked about, is building in accountability. So my pastor used to say, you want people to do the right thing for the right reason, but sometimes you have to sort of create an environment where they do the right thing for the wrong reasons, right? Which is, listen, I gotta do this, right? Because my compensation is tied to it. My tenure is tied to it. My merit increase might be tied to it, et cetera. So one of the things we'd like to do is sort of build in accountability and let the departments determine what the goals are, right? Rather than it being top down, say, here's what we're going to do to move the needle. And we have to define the needle. That's what collective impact does. Everybody agrees, these are the outcomes we want to achieve. Yes, these are the outcomes we want to achieve. I'm not gonna tell Professor Kaufman how to do that, right? He knows best how to do that. I'm not gonna tell Professor Lansmar how to do that. He knows best how to do that. And Dr. Jean-Charles, she knows best. But one of the things we will all contribute to are the set of goals that they'll establish, and then we'll hold them accountable to that. That's the goal, that's the objective, that's true collective impact. You use the creativity and the expertise that they bring to solve a common problem. And that's the direction we hope to go for.
We have time for one or
Thank you.
two more.
And we'll promise to be short on our answers.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. Kind of a follow-up to that question that you were just talking about, and also a piece that our professors brought up before you guys came in was just this idea that almost sounds to me like a bait and switch, or doing the right thing for the wrong reason. And I'm just curious about the actual impact of that if you're not reaching someone on a true level, or if you think that you can reach them by maybe, I'm going to use the word, tricking them into doing something that they might not be willing to do otherwise.
Yeah, let me correct myself. I wasn't talking about bait and switch or correcting them. I'm saying there will be, so you think about the innovation, the cycle, right? There are always the early adopters. So people, something new comes out and then people will just buy it because of it. They'll stand in line for that next iPhone, right? Then there's going to be the the innovators, the early adopters, and then the large majority, right? The early majority will do something. Then there'll be the late majority. They'll wait till everybody else does it, and then they'll do it. But then there are always the laggards, those who just won't do it. I will not be moved, right? They sing the song, I will not be moved. They hate change in that regard. You actually have to create the environment so that they will actually align the behaviors regardless of whether or not they want to do it. That's what I'm talking about. So if there is an alignment around your merit, your increase or your evaluation that said, these are the 3 things you have to be doing. You have to be going out and recruiting people of color or women, et cetera, et cetera. You have to have positive reviews on your performance as a teacher, et cetera. Whether you want to do it or not, you will do it. That's what I mean, not the bait and switch. We can't fool anybody to do this. We have to kind of create the environment, and transparency is key in this work. We have to be transparent in all of this work. So the rationale for why we're doing it has to be very clear. But as you know, in this political discourse, there are people who still believe that we never landed on the moon in 1969. You're not going to change them.
And that's consistent with what Professor Kaufman showed us earlier. That is to say, you may or may not change the belief system, but through tasking, you can still get people to do the thing that needs to be done, and that lays the foundation for larger cultural change. We've got up top.
Sorry, hi. Kind of we were talking into this. Thank you for the conversation. Following up on that same line of questioning, in undergrad, me and my friends founded this organization that was designed to address issues of racism across every crevice of campus. And one of those areas was looking at the university curriculum across departments to look at if it was actively anti-racist. And we didn't see that. So one of the conversations we were having with faculty was, how do you pick up a social justice paradigm approach, a transformative paradigm to your approach of teaching, and how do you address the experiences of students of color in your classroom? Because it's not just about the content, but it's about, if you have the only Black student in an econ class, how do you make sure that student feels comfortable in that space? Just like if a conservative student was to say they're not comfortable, you would make sure that they're comfortable, like Dr. Richards did mentioned earlier. But one of the issues that I ran into was academic freedom, especially for tenured professors. So how do you have that conversation with your colleagues, or as students, as student organizers and activists, how do we convince tenured faculty that this is not coming at the expense of their academic freedom, which was something that was always brought up, because universities are supposed to be places where faculty have that freedom and there's diversity of thought, and they can disagree with us that there's social justice in everything that you try to teach, or racism is involved in those systems. They can.
Okay, those are not questions that yield to short answers, but
Okay.
Well, I'll try to be short.
Okay.
There's something I often tell my students, and it applies so well right now, is that democracy is not for the faint of heart. And diversity, equity, and inclusion is not for the faint of heart. This is not easy work. It's messy work. And we have to take wins where we can get them, but not be deterred by the losses that will come. And there are some faculty that are just not going to come along, right? There's just nothing you can do about that. But if you can impact the good critical mass, then the change will begin to spread. And faculty are human beings. They're impacted by their colleagues. And if they see the change happening among their colleagues, they'll either come along or they'll leave. They'll go to another university. But the idea is to continue to knock on that door till it opens. You know, continue to plug away and try not to give up. You know, my dad used to always say it's easy to give up. You know, it's hard to stick to it and see it through. You know, and the last example, and then I'll be quiet. You all familiar with the 409 cleaning formula? Everybody heard of the 409? Well, anyway, there's a formula out there called 409. Does anybody know why? Just take a random guess at why it would be called 409. Because they tried 408 times and failed and got it right on the 409th time. So you have to ask yourself the question, would you have stuck to it after it failed 10 times? It failed 20 times? 100 times? This is work that you're gonna get a lot of failures, but you gotta stick to it because somewhere this key is gonna turn, right? Just like those students thought about it 50 years ago. Maybe it took 50 years for all this to happen, but it happened, right? And our students didn't give up. The students that came behind them, they picked up the struggle, you know, and there was other ones that had tried in the 70s and the 80s and even in the 90s, you know, but students just keep plugging away and then somebody's gonna hit that chord, right? And change will happen, you know, and it's unfortunate that an incident like somebody being killed seems to resonate through our society and cause some of the change. But just like I talked about inertia and force and mass time acceleration, inertia will continue until somebody makes a change. And that force has to come from the people actively engaging and trying to change what's happening around us.
There has been a lot of controversy that's been raised over the last couple of weeks and months about racism in professional sports and around the very structure and culture of our professional sports society. Next week, we have the Kraft family and a distinguished player coming in to talk about racism and anti-Semitism. I encourage you to spread the word on that. It'll be a very interesting conversation. I urge you again to vote next Tuesday. And there is a presentation from the lead writer of the 1619 project, which has been mentioned a couple of times in this class, is coming Monday evening at 6:30. That's happening over at Mass College of Art and Design, and you can sign up for their webinar for free if you want to hear more about the 1619 project. And we get a round of applause for our speakers.